Château-Thierry, France, June 1, 1918, and Captain Lloyd Williams of the 5th Marine Regiment stands at a crossroads watching French soldiers streaming past in retreat. Their faces are hollow with exhaustion and terror. Some have thrown away their rifles. Officers on horseback shout contradictory orders that no one follows. The road is clogged with civilians fleeing ahead of the German advance, carrying whatever possessions they can manage in carts and wheelbarrows and on their backs. A French colonel riding a lathered horse reins up beside Williams and shouts in broken English that the Americans must fall back immediately. The Germans are coming. Paris will fall within days. Everything is lost. Captain Williams, a Marine Corps officer who enlisted as a private in 1909 and earned his commission through merit rather than privilege, looks at the French colonel and delivers a response that will become legendary in Marine Corps history. Retreat hell, we just got here. What Captain Williams cannot know as he watches the tide of French defeat flowing past him is that his Marines and the American soldiers arriving behind them represent the turning point of the entire war. That German General Erich Ludendorff's Great Spring Offensive has finally exhausted itself against American resistance. That within weeks the initiative will shift permanently to the Allies. That the war Germany thought it could win before American power became overwhelming is already lost. The story of how American entry turned World War I around is not a simple tale of fresh troops arriving to rescue exhausted allies, though that is part of it. It is a complex narrative of timing and logistics and psychology and strategic calculation, where American power, both actual and potential, transformed a war of attrition into a race against time that Germany could not win. When America declared war on April 6, 1917, the military contribution it could make immediately was negligible. The United States Army numbered only 130,000 men. America had no modern tanks, no effective anti-aircraft guns, limited artillery, and almost no experience with the kind of industrial warfare being waged on the Western Front. But what America had was potential. An industrial base larger than any European power. A population of over 100 million that could be mobilized for war. Financial resources that dwarfed what the exhausted European economies could produce. And most critically, time to transform that potential into actual military power, while the Allies held the line against Germany. The German High Command understood this calculation perfectly. General Erich Ludendorff, the de facto commander of German forces, knew that once American troops began arriving in France in large numbers, Germany would face an opponent it could not defeat through attrition. Every month that passed brought more American soldiers to France. Every week saw more American industrial output converted to weapons and supplies. Every day the balance of power shifted incrementally but inexorably against Germany. Ludendorff recognized that Germany had one narrow window of opportunity to win the war. In late 1917, Russia collapsed into revolution and withdrew from the war, allowing Germany to transfer dozens of divisions from the Eastern Front to the West. For the first time since 1914, Germany would have numerical superiority on the Western Front. But this advantage would be temporary, lasting only until American reinforcements tipped the scales back to the Allies. Ludendorff calculated that he had perhaps 4 to 6 months to achieve what Germany had failed to accomplish in 3.5 years of war. Break through the Allied lines, separate the British and French armies, capture Paris or at least force France to sue for peace before American power became overwhelming. The German Spring Offensive that Ludendorff planned was the largest and most sophisticated military operation Germany had yet attempted. Ludendorff concentrated over 1 million men, including elite stormtrooper units trained in new infiltration tactics that emphasized speed and flexibility over the rigid linear attacks that had characterized earlier offensives. The attack would begin with the most massive artillery bombardment in history. Over 6,000 guns firing shells containing high explosive gas and smoke would pound Allied positions for 5 hours, destroying communication lines, killing defenders, and creating chaos that German stormtroopers would exploit. The stormtroopers would bypass strongpoints flowing through gaps in Allied lines, like water, finding every weakness, pushing as deep as possible, as fast as possible. Follow-on forces would mop up bypassed positions, while the spearhead units advanced toward strategic objectives. The plan was audacious, risky, and represented Germany's last hope for victory. Operation Michael, the first phase of the Spring Offensive, began on March 21, 1918, at 4:40 in the morning, when German artillery opened fire along a 50-mile front near the Somme River. The bombardment was unlike anything yet experienced in the war. Over 1 million shells fell on British positions in 5 hours. Entire villages disappeared. Communication trenches collapsed, burying men alive. Poison gas drifted through British lines, killing men who could not get their masks on in time. When the barrage lifted, German stormtroopers emerged from the morning fog, advancing in small groups using grenades and flamethrowers to clear British trenches. The British Fifth Army defending the sector had been weakened by the need to extend its lines after French units were withdrawn. The German attack broke through British defenses within hours, creating a gap that threatened to become a rout. German forces advanced up to 40 miles in the first week of the offensive, the deepest penetration since 1914. British commanders warned that the army might be pushed back to the Channel ports. French generals prepared to fall back to defend Paris. Allied politicians began to contemplate defeat. But the German advance, though impressive, could not achieve the decisive breakthrough Ludendorff needed. The stormtroopers pushed so far ahead of their supply lines that they literally outran their logistical support. Exhausted German soldiers discovered Allied supply dumps full of food and wine and stopped to loot them, while the offensive lost momentum. British and French forces, though battered, managed to maintain some semblance of cohesion, retreating in fighting order rather than dissolving into panic. Most critically, the gap that Ludendorff hoped to drive between British and French forces never fully opened. The Allies maintained contact between their armies and coordinated their defense under the newly appointed Supreme Allied Commander, French General Ferdinand Foch. By early April, the German offensive had stalled, having gained territory but failed to destroy Allied armies or capture strategically vital objectives. Ludendorff's window of opportunity was closing, faster than he had anticipated, because American troops were arriving in France faster than German intelligence had estimated. In March 1918, when Operation Michael began, there were approximately 300,000 American soldiers in France. By June, that number would exceed 1 million. The rate of American deployment shocked German planners, who had calculated based on shipping availability that Americans could not arrive in such numbers until late 1918 or early 1919, but the United States had commandeered every available merchant ship and pressed British vessels into service transporting American troops. The convoy system developed to combat German submarines proved remarkably effective, with very few troop ships lost to U-boat attack. American soldiers were arriving at French ports at a rate of 250,000 per month, turning the potential threat of American manpower into the actual presence of American divisions in France. These soldiers were not yet as experienced as veteran French or British troops, but they were fresh, enthusiastic, and represented an inexhaustible reserve that Germany could not match. The psychological impact of American arrival equaled its military significance. French soldiers, who had endured 3.5 years of slaughter, who had survived Verdun and the mutinies of 1917, who had watched their country bled white, saw American troops marching through French villages and felt something they had almost forgotten: hope. British soldiers, exhausted by the German spring offensive, took comfort in knowing that relief was coming, that they only had to hold on a bit longer. Allied civilians saw American soldiers in Paris and began to believe that the war might actually be won, rather than simply endured until both sides collapsed. German soldiers, meanwhile, learned from prisoners and captured documents that hundreds of thousands of Americans were arriving in France. The realization that Germany was now fighting not just France and Britain, but the industrial might of America undermined German morale in ways that no Allied propaganda could achieve. The first major American combat operation came in late May 1918, when the 1st Division attacked the village of Cantigny in a limited offensive designed to prove American soldiers could fight effectively in modern warfare. The division attacked on May 28th, capturing Cantigny and holding it against fierce German counterattacks. The operation was small in scale, involving only one division, but its significance was enormous. American soldiers had attacked prepared German positions and won. They had held captured ground against experienced German troops. They had demonstrated that American training and leadership could produce soldiers capable of matching German veterans. Pershing used the victory at Cantigny to reinforce his insistence that American forces fight as independent American units rather than being parceled out to French and British commands. The victory proved that American divisions could accomplish missions without constant Allied supervision. But Cantigny was a preliminary. The real test of American arms came in June 1918 at Belleau Wood and Chateau Thierry, when German forces launched another offensive aimed at Paris. The German attack on May 27th along the Chemin des Dames drove French forces back in confusion. Within days, German troops had crossed the Marne River and were advancing on Chateau Thierry, just 50 miles from Paris. The roads to the capital seemed open with French forces, retreating, and little to stop German spearheads from reaching the outskirts of Paris itself. Into this crisis marched American forces, the 2nd Division, including the 4th Marine Brigade and the 3rd Division, deployed to block the German advance. On June 1st, Marines of the 2nd Division reached positions near Belleau Wood and Chateau Thierry just as French forces were falling back in disorder. This was the moment when Captain Lloyd Williams delivered his famous rebuke to the French colonel urging retreat. The Marines did not retreat. They dug in. They prepared to fight. And on June 6th, they attacked into Belleau Wood, a square mile of forest that German forces had turned into a fortress, bristling with machine gun nests and artillery positions. The battle that followed would last 3 weeks and cost the Marines over 1,800 dead, with another 7,000 wounded. The fighting was brutal beyond anything Americans had yet experienced. Marines advancing across wheat fields toward the wood were cut down by German machine guns, firing at point-blank range. Companies that began attacks with 200 men finished with 20. The Marines attacked and were thrown back and attacked again, learning through blood what European soldiers had learned over years, that modern defensive warfare gave enormous advantages to defenders with machine guns and artillery. But the Marines kept attacking. When German positions could not be taken by frontal assault, they were flanked. When machine gun nests proved impregnable, Marines crawled close enough to throw grenades or use their rifles to pick off German gunners. The forest itself became a nightmare of shell-torn trees and poison gas and bodies rotting in summer heat. Marines fought from crater to crater through underbrush thick with German positions. Officers and sergeants led from the front and died from the front, with casualties among junior leaders reaching catastrophic levels. Marine Gunnery Sergeant Dan Daly, rallying his platoon for an attack across an open field toward German positions, reportedly shouted, "Come on, you sons of bitches, do you want to live forever?" The Marines followed him into machine gun fire, because that is what Marines did. They attacked. The Germans defending Belleau Wood were not second-rate troops, but experienced veterans who had fought on every front of the war. They respected the Marines' courage, while being astonished by their tactics. German after-action reports described American attacks as brave but wasteful, noting that Marines repeatedly charged machine gun positions that should have been bypassed or suppressed with artillery. The Germans were right. American tactics at Belleau Wood were often costly and inefficient, but the Marines learned quickly, adapting their methods each day, incorporating lessons paid for in blood. By mid-June, Marine attacks had become more sophisticated, using fire and maneuver, coordinating with artillery, employing grenades and automatic weapons more effectively. The learning curve was steep and expensive, but American officers and men proved capable of learning. On June 26, 1918, after 3 weeks of fighting, Marines cleared the last German positions from Belleau Wood. A Marine officer sent a message to headquarters that would become famous. Wood's now U.S. Marine Corps entirely. The French were so impressed by Marine tenacity that they renamed the forest Bois de la Brigade de Marine, Wood of the Marine Brigade. The battle cost the Marines dearly, with casualties approaching 50% in some units. But Belleau Wood proved several things that changed Allied and German calculations about the war. It proved that American soldiers could fight and win against veteran German troops. It proved that American units could sustain heavy casualties and continue fighting. It proved that American replacements could arrive quickly enough to rebuild shattered units. Most importantly, it proved to the Germans that they were no longer fighting exhausted French and British armies that might break. They were now fighting fresh American divisions that would keep coming no matter the cost. While Marines fought at Belleau, Wood soldiers of the 3rd Division held the Marne River bridges at Château Thierry, preventing German forces from crossing. The 3rd Division earned the nickname Rock of the Marne for their defense. German attacks tried repeatedly to force the bridges, but American machine gunners and riflemen held their positions, inflicting heavy casualties on German troops trying to cross. The defense of Château Thierry, combined with the Marine attack at Belleau Wood, stopped the German advance on Paris cold. By mid-June, Ludendorff's second great offensive had failed, just as Operation Michael had failed in March. Germany had gained ground but failed to destroy Allied armies or capture objectives that would force Allied surrender. Ludendorff launched more offensives through June and July, throwing German reserves into attacks that achieved less and less as American numbers grew and German strength waned. Each German attack was met by increasingly effective Allied defense, with American divisions playing larger roles. American artillery learned to coordinate with infantry. American machine gunners learned to create killing zones. American intelligence learned to predict German attacks. The American Expeditionary Force was becoming a modern army through the hardest schooling imaginable: combat. By mid-July 1918, the strategic situation had fundamentally shifted. German offensives had exhausted Germany's reserves. Allied armies, reinforced by hundreds of thousands of Americans, were preparing to counterattack. The initiative that Germany had seized in March was passing to the Allies. On July 18, 1918, Allied forces, including American divisions, launched a major counteroffensive near Soissons. The attack was designed by French General Foch to cut the salient the German forces had driven toward Paris. American divisions, including the 1st and 2nd, attacked without preparatory bombardment, achieving surprise and driving deep into German positions. The 1st Division advanced 8 kilometers in the first day, capturing thousands of prisoners and dozens of guns. The attack proved that American divisions could not only defend but could conduct offensive operations successfully. More attacks followed, with American forces playing increasingly central roles. The reduction of the Saint-Mihiel salient in September 1918 saw the 1st American Army, under Pershing's direct command, conduct its first major independent operation. 550,000 American soldiers attacked German positions that had stood since 1914. The attack achieved complete success, capturing the salient in 4 days with relatively light casualties. But the Meuse-Argonne offensive, launched on September 26, 1918, would prove to be America's greatest and costliest battle. Pershing committed over 1 million American soldiers to an attack through some of the most difficult terrain on the Western Front. The Argonne Forest was a tangled mass of hills, ravines, and thick woods that German forces had fortified over 4 years. German defenses included multiple trench lines, concrete bunkers, machine gun positions designed to create interlocking fields of fire, and artillery carefully registered on every approach. American forces attacked into this fortress with determination that exceeded their tactical skill. The first days of the offensive saw American divisions make limited gains at heavy cost. Traffic jams developed behind the lines as inexperienced staff officers struggled to coordinate the movement of supplies and reinforcements. Artillery support proved inadequate, with American gunners unable to effectively suppress German defenses. Infantry units became disorganized in the rough terrain, losing contact with neighboring units and creating gaps that German counterattacks exploited. The Meuse-Argonne offensive revealed the limitations of the American expeditionary force. American divisions were enthusiastic and brave, but still learning the tactical sophistication that came only from extended combat experience. American staff work was often chaotic, with breakdowns in communication and supply that would have been unacceptable in veteran French or British formations. American casualties mounted rapidly, with some divisions suffering 50% losses in the first week of fighting. But American numerical superiority made those casualties sustainable. Divisions that were shattered could be withdrawn and replaced with fresh divisions. The pipeline of American replacements seemed endless from German perspective. For every American killed or wounded, 2 more arrived from the United States. Germany could not replace its losses at anything like American rates. Through October and early November, American forces ground forward through the Argonne. The advance was methodical and expensive, but inexorable. German defenses that should have held for weeks were overwhelmed by American persistence. Villages that German commanders considered impregnable fell to American attacks. By early November, American forces had broken through the main German defensive lines and were advancing into open country beyond. The Meuse-Argonne offensive cost over 120,000 American casualties, including 26,000 dead. It was the bloodiest battle in American history to that point, but it achieved Pershing's objective of breaking the German defensive system and forcing German forces into retreat. Combined with British and French offensives along other sectors of the front, the Meuse-Argonne offensive convinced German commanders that continuing the war was pointless. American numerical superiority was now overwhelming. American industrial production was flooding Allied armies with weapons and supplies. American financial resources were sustaining Allied economies. Germany faced not just defeat, but destruction if the war continued. The German government requested an armistice on October 4, 1918, based on President Wilson's 14 points. The request acknowledged that Germany could not win and hoped to end the war before Allied armies invaded German territory. Negotiations dragged through October as the Allies debated terms while their armies continued attacking. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the armistice came into effect, and the guns finally fell silent after 4 years of slaughter. American soldiers who had been attacking that morning found themselves standing in trenches or shell craters in sudden, eerie quiet. Some cheered, some wept, some simply sat down too exhausted to react. They had survived. The war was over. America had helped win it. The transformation that American entry produced in World War I was not immediate or simple. America did not arrive in France and immediately turn the tide. The process took time. American military power in 1917 was negligible, and even by mid-1918, American forces were still learning how to fight effectively. But what America brought to the war was potential that became reality faster than Germany could counter it. the industrial base that produced tanks and artillery and aircraft, the financial resources that kept Allied economies functioning, the manpower reserves that could replace casualties indefinitely, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological boost that came from knowing that fresh troops were arriving, that the balance was shifting, that victory was possible. Germany's spring offensive of 1918 represented the German High Command's recognition that they had to win before American power became decisive. The offensives failed not primarily because of tactical errors, though there were many, but because Germany was racing against time in a race it could not win. Every week that passed brought more Americans to France. Every month, the balance shifted more decisively against Germany. By summer 1918, American divisions were arriving faster than Germany could train replacements for its losses. By fall 1918, over 2 million American soldiers were in France, with more arriving daily. Germany faced an enemy that could not be exhausted, that could replace every loss, that would keep attacking, until Germany collapsed. The armistice came when German commanders recognized that continuing to fight would only increase German casualties without changing the inevitable outcome. The cost of American participation in World War I was substantial, though lower than what France or Britain had paid. Over 116,000 Americans died, including over 53,000 killed in action. 204,000 were wounded. The American economy was mobilized for war with unprecedented government intervention in industry and transportation. American civil liberties were curtailed, with dissenters imprisoned and German Americans persecuted. The America that emerged from World War I was different from the country that had entered it. More militarized, more centralized, more aware of its power and more willing to use it. The war transformed America from a regional power, focused primarily on the Western Hemisphere, into a global power with interests and military forces deployed worldwide. The impact of American entry on the Allied war effort cannot be reduced to simple numbers, though the numbers are impressive. 2 million American soldiers in France by war's end. Vast quantities of supplies and weapons produced by American industry. Billions of dollars in loans that sustained Allied economies. But beyond the material contribution, America provided something equally important: hope. French civilians who had endured years of occupation and loss saw American soldiers and believed their country might be liberated. British soldiers, exhausted by years of trench warfare, took comfort in American reinforcements. Allied leaders who had doubted whether victory was possible came to believe that Germany could be defeated. German commanders, meanwhile, had to recalculate their strategies, knowing that they faced not a weakening enemy, but one growing stronger every day. The battles that American soldiers fought in 1918 were not perfect displays of military art. American tactics were often crude and costly. American staff work was frequently chaotic. American commanders made mistakes that more experienced Allied officers would have avoided. But American soldiers learned quickly. The divisions that stumbled through their first battles at Belleau Wood and Château Thierry were conducting sophisticated combined arms operations by the Meuse-Argonne. American artillery that was ineffective in June had become lethal by November. American infantry that attacked in dense formations in their first battles had learned fire and maneuver by war's end. The learning was expensive, paid for in blood, but it was real and remarkably rapid. General Pershing's insistence on maintaining an independent American army separate from French and British command proved strategically crucial. An independent American army gave the United States a voice in peace negotiations that it would not have had if American soldiers had been scattered through Allied formations. American military independence allowed the United States to pursue its own strategic objectives, rather than simply reinforcing Allied plans. Most importantly, American independence created a force that could continue fighting if France or Britain collapsed or made separate peace with Germany. The psychological impact on Germany of facing a completely fresh enemy with unlimited resources was perhaps as important as any battlefield victory. German soldiers learned that defeating American attacks accomplished little because more American divisions would arrive. German commanders understood that the strategic situation was hopeless, that time and resources were running out, that defeat was inevitable. The American expeditionary force that began arriving in France in summer 1917 was an army of amateurs, led by a small cadre of professionals who faced the enormous task of building a modern military force while simultaneously fighting a war. That it succeeded at all is remarkable. That it succeeded quickly enough to decisively influence the war's outcome is extraordinary. The transformation of American military power from the tiny peacetime army of April 1917 to the 2-million-man force of November 1918 represented an organizational and logistical achievement comparable to any military accomplishment of the war. Building the training camps to house and train recruits, creating the transportation infrastructure to move men and supplies from American factories to French battlefields, developing the staff systems to coordinate operations involving millions of men. These were problems that the U.S. Army had never faced at such scale, and the solutions, developed often through trial and error, created the foundation for American military power throughout the 20th century. The armistice of November 11, 1918, came before American military power reached its peak. Plans existed for offensives in 1919 that would have employed 4 million American soldiers in France, attacking with overwhelming superiority in men and material. The war ended before these plans were executed, but their existence influenced German calculations about continuing the war. German commanders knew that 1919 would bring even more American divisions, that the balance would shift even more decisively against Germany, that defeat in 1919 would be even more catastrophic than armistice in 1918. The knowledge that American power was still growing, that the worst was yet to come, helped convince German leaders to seek peace while they could still negotiate rather than continuing until Germany was invaded and destroyed. The story of how American entry turned World War I around is ultimately a story about potential becoming reality, about a nation that in April 1917 could barely defend itself, transforming in 18 months into a military power that deployed 2 million soldiers to Europe, about soldiers who began as raw recruits, becoming veterans through the hardest schooling imaginable, about an industrial economy shifting from peacetime production to become the arsenal that supplied not just American forces, but Allied armies, about a democracy mobilizing resources and manpower on a scale that rivaled or exceeded what autocratic empires could achieve. The transformation was not easy or cheap. Over 100,000 Americans died to achieve it. Tens of thousands more came home wounded or scarred by experiences they could never fully explain to those who had not been there. But the transformation was real, and it decided the war. Captain Lloyd Williams, standing at that crossroads near Chateau Thierry on June 1, 1918, watching French soldiers retreat, while telling the French colonel that his Marines would not fall back, was expressing something fundamental about American military power. Not that American soldiers were better than French or British troops, though they would prove they could fight as effectively as any army. Not that American tactics were superior, though Americans would learn and adapt. What Williams was expressing was American determination backed by American resources that made retreat unnecessary. The Marines did not need to retreat because more Marines were coming. The supplies would not run out because American factories would produce more. The losses could be sustained because American manpower was nearly inexhaustible. Germany could not match that combination, and once German commanders understood that reality, the war was effectively over. The fighting would continue for 5 more months. Americans would die by the thousands in the Argonne forest and along the Meuse River. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. American entry into World War I turned the war around not in a single dramatic moment, but through the relentless accumulation of power that transformed potential into victory.